For most car enthusiasts, there's always that fantasy of opening up the door to some barn or walking through a junkyard or just browsing all the sites where the results show up on Auto Tempest and finding some dirty, dusty, dingy, neglected, but amazing car in a barn. That's the idea of these barn find stories, and we love them here at VINwiki because the tale of finding the car, cleaning the car, fixing the car, restoring it, and then enjoying the car is always an amazing car story. We've had a lot of them over the years, and today I've compiled our top 10 VINwiki barn find stories. And today's video is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp makes therapy and counseling easier, more accessible, and more affordable than ever, and you can get it from your phone, from your computer, anywhere you'd like. It works great from your home, office, or anywhere else you want to enjoy therapy, and it's so easy because within 48 hours in most cases, you'll take their little survey, set up an account, and they'll match you with a therapist that's perfectly matched to whatever it is that you're looking to deal with. Whether it's a relationship issue, a work issue, depression, anxiety, anything that you'd like some help or some counseling for, BetterHelp's team of therapists is there for you. And if it turns out that it's not the best fit, generally you just press a button and within a couple hours they've got you somebody else that's perfectly aligned with whatever it is that you're looking to work on. So the path to mental health and the path to a better life starts with BetterHelp. And you can start with a 10% discount on your first month by clicking the link at the description below or going to betterhelp.com/VINwiki. Let them know that you appreciate their support of the channel and they'll appreciate the chance to work through whatever your problem is and put you on the path to a better life. So thank you as always to BetterHelp for supporting the VINwiki YouTube channel, and I hope that you enjoy today's top 10 VINwiki barn find stories.
It's the rarest body NASCAR in the world, right? So I put £5 in his pocket, I put £3 in his pocket, £500 here, £500 in my coat, and £1,000 in the car. We go back 10 years, okay, when I met my lovely lady. I was broke. Yeah, the whole idea of Hard Up Garage kind of came to mind. And I loved the Disney Cars movie, okay, because it still had everything for everyone. The granddads loved the Plymouth Superbird, you know, the people in my area loved like the NASCARs, and then you had like the older 1920s cars for your granddads. Like it had a bit for everyone. It had like the Route 66. Everyone around the world dreams of that, you know. And for me, the Daytona and the Superbirds are my favorite car in the world. I'm broke, you know, I've got a little boy on the way and I can't afford a piece of American muscle, even though, you know, I grow up with American cars. I can't afford anything nice. So I buy a Cadillac Coupe de Ville, 1976. It's been in a garden for 10 years. The bonnet is so rusted that there's just the frame left. It's fallen into the engine. And it's got a Starcraft camper body on the back of it, yeah? So like it's got like the front of a 76 Cadillac, and then an over-the-top camper body over the top. And I'm thinking, how am I going to sticker this? How am I going to paint it? I had to make the bonnet out of wood, okay, because the bonnet was so rotten that I couldn't get another 1976 Cadillac bonnet in the UK. So I welded some frame together and, you know, basically made some 8mm ply and made a hood. And then down the side, they stickered it as a Dynaco race car. Yeah, and everyone in the world has heard of the amazing Brooklands racetrack. It's the most famous banked racetrack in England. That's how they used to train and test all the cars back in the day. So I turned up with my lovely lady in the back of the car and my child in her belly. We turn up at the Brooklands Motor Museum, right, which is next to Mercedes-Benz World, where I qualified earlier to be a Mercedes-Benz mechanic. And I turn up in my £580, $750 Cadillac Coupe de Ville camper, which I turned up and it broke down at the gate, yeah? But stickered on the side is a Dynaco race car. It's the coolest car in the world, in my opinion. Hanging out the left-hand side, everyone's taking photos, not only because it looks cool, but because I've broken down, right? But then there's a man called Don Scott, okay, who is world famous for his 43 Petty NASCAR in the UK, just had it painted, and he was unveiling it at Brooklands Motor Museum on the back of a lorry. Turns out that I broke down in front of his lorry as he was unveiling the 43 Plymouth Petty car, and I broke down in my Dynaco 43 next to it. And the press are going crazy. The kids are going nuts. And it gave me this feeling of love that every generation in the world loves that film. You've got 3-year-old children going, oh, it's the king, it's the king. You've got Don Scott behind me in a $100,000 Petty car. It could be a replica, could be like a real car. And then I've got my £700 absolute box, right? And my heart's pounding because everyone loves it. And it doesn't matter what it costs. Money's irrelevant, right? It's about feeling the love that everyone there is feeling. That's what owning a car or a custom car that you built is about, right? Again, everyone's appreciation, no matter how bad or how good it is, it's about people's love on the same level. So a few years later, down in Hampshire in England, I got told that there's a very, very famous, if not the most famous NASCAR in the world, right? On top of a container. And by the most famous NASCAR in the world, okay, we're talking about untouchable cars. Petty race cars, they've been for sale, okay? Dale Earnhardt cars, they've been for sale. Have you ever seen a Lightning McQueen full-size NASCAR for sale in the world? Doesn't exist, because what happened back in the pre-production of the show is they had these cars that went round to the previews of the cars. So, you know, at the premiere, that kind of stuff, they had a life-size NASCAR Lightning McQueen out the front, right? And they went down to a salvage yard in London where they were supposed to be crushed, okay? So there was a Lightning McQueen, there was a Luigi, and the little forklift truck, yeah? And they were all supposed to be crushed. They crushed them all with diggers, and they had to show videos and photos of the crushed cars. Well, what they did, and this is a story, okay? They got a speedboat, a red one, put some stickers on it, and crushed it, right? And then sent photos to whoever it was in the world and said that we crushed it. And it stayed in a container for years, hidden out the way, until one day the guy passed away and then it got put on top of the container, right? And we're talking this car has got 25-inch steel aero NASCAR wheels with pre-production one-of-one Goodyear rubber tires on, right? These tires don't fit any production vehicle in the world. They're like this high. They're huge. You got to imagine the enormity of this car, okay? Most NASCARs are long, yeah? The Lightning McQueen car is stumpy and it's fat and it's wide and it's got a presence that as it comes towards you, it can show you its might. So it goes around the corner and it's big and it's wide and it's low, right? Well, they had to replicate that in a real car. This thing is like 15 foot, 16 foot long. It's 7.5 foot wide. And the wheels are huge. Like you see any cartoon drawing, the wheels are bigger than the proportion of the car. And it doesn't steer. Imagine it. It is a fiberglass body, right? I get down on my knees and there is a Walt Disney or Pixar plate or like a production plate, one of how many plate, right, on the door. So I knew it was real. I was like, I need that car. And the guy, it's not for sale. Took me 5 years. People don't understand, right? When you see a barn find in someone's garden, or you see a car rotting away, or your dream car that an old man down the road, oh, I'm going to fix it one day, right? They all say it and it never happens, right? Well, you got to go down there once every 3 or 4 months, go down there and buy a box of donuts, right? Buy a can of beer, you know, sit down and have a chat with the old guys in the office. Just get to know them, build a relationship, okay? Because you're not a guy that just wants. You're not down there saying, I want to buy it, want to buy it, want to buy it. I know who's in charge down there. I know where the car is. It is not going anywhere. The only person they've got in mind for that car is me, right? Spent 5 years taking donuts, probably spent $200-300 in donuts to buy a Lightning McQueen car. Like, that's quite as good as it comes. Finally, the guy phones me and is like, what's this Lightning McQueen car worth to you? So I'm like, right, well, I'm thinking it's going to be 10 grand, right? Okay, it's the rarest body NASCAR in the world, right? So I put 5 grand in his pocket. I put 3 grand in his pocket, £500 here, £500 in my coat, and £1,000 in the car. So I turn up and we're negotiating. And my buddy is good friends with the owner. And he was like, come on, just sell him. Me and my son want to build a car. And I got there and I'm like, it's going to be 10 grand. It's going to be 10 grand. So we walk up and I buy it for £500, right? $750. And he's like, look, the owner's passed away. It's just sat there. Give us a drink for the lads. We'll take them out for Christmas. So it wasn't really a payment. It was, I paid for their Christmas due, right? And we pick it up with our Hiab, right? And we're loading it on the truck. And I don't think I've ever been excited about anything more in my whole life, okay? Every dream I've ever had from that 10 years before turned up in my fake Dynaco box, right? To having a real, genuine Lightning McQueen car, you know? It doesn't get any cooler than that. This is the rarest NASCAR in the world, and I'm the only man that I know, apart from Pixar and Disney, that own it, right? I did a receipt, I signed car body, fake, to Sam R, this day, whatever. And I put it on the recovery truck, and we're going down the road, and I'm looking in my rearview mirror, and I'm like, oh my God. So yes, I was illegal getting my phone out and taking a photo, but it was 5 years ago. Come catch me, Mr. Plod. But you know what? I've never been so excited, right? I took it back and I rolled it into its space. You can't steer it. It's a bit like the Lycan Hypersport back in the day. You know, there's no steering. This is a prop. It's made to look good. The decals were faded. You know, it looked a mess. Once again, a lovely gentleman from Europe phones me and says, you got Lightning McQueen? I went, yeah, it's not for sale. He said, come on, man, everything's for sale. I said, no, it's not for sale. I'm going to put a car in it, and I'm going to drive it to SEMA. I don't know. I'm going to do something stupid, like I'm going to put a NASCAR in it. You know, I'm known for the NAS Charger, putting a NASCAR in the Dodge Charger from Universal Studios. Maybe I can do the same again. Like, I had all ideas. Maybe I could put a TVR in it. You know, a nice lightweight chassis, make some custom wheels. And when a man turns up and offers you 15 grand for a fiberglass body that you pay 500 quid for, that's the time to just pull the trigger. Them things happen once in a lifetime, but we made a deal. I said, the deal is I'll give you that car for this figure. I can't remember if it's 10 or 15 grand, whatever we agreed on, right? I'll give you that car for that figure. But the deal is he was a very clever man, he's an artist, really. I said, I want a fiberglass mold made, and I want my own Lightning McQueen body. And he promised me, handshake, man to man, he'd give me a fiberglass mold. He'd take a mold of the car and give it to me. So I haven't got it yet. So Mr. Man out there, you owe me a Lightning McQueen body, and don't let me down, all right? But yeah, so that's how I bought the cheapest, most famous NASCAR in the world.
Here's where I say something clever, and now you roll the music. I don't know how I orbit around Hazard County, but somehow Travis Bell, for years, was the mecca of the Dukes of Hazzard. During this obsession of the television show and cars flying and things going on, I realized that the first 5 episodes of the Dukes of Hazzard were filmed in Georgia, and you can still visit the sites. It pretty much is all still there, but in the late 90s and early 2000s, it really still looked the same. Because granted, the show had filmed down here in 78. So we would come down from Indianapolis and just bang around and drive General Lee's around and go play the Dukes of Hazzard. And of course, you know, down here, and they're like, hey, it's Bo and Luke. And we're like, hey, you know, nothing to see here. But then we wanted to find the people that worked on the show. And we would actually make these little beautiful flyers with a wanted poster. It says, if you were here this day when the car flew, call this number or whatever else. And we put them in little diners, and where the cars flew, there's obviously telephone poles and stuff. We'd take this 20-foot ladder and put this sign up. It says, if you were here on this day, blah, 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 when the car flew. And people would call. They said, yes, they held the school bus up that day just to jump the car down the street. And Mom and Dad were so mad because I was late from school. And they had all these great stories. And then we started finding the people that painted the cars in and around Conyers, Georgia, and Covington, and Snailville, Georgia, and all these other places. And then we found the transportation directors, and they were like going, oh, now we got these gold mine people. And we had this fellow's name. His name was Don Schischler. And Don Schischler has won Academy Awards, and he was a director and second unit DP. And he had no reason to be nice to me. I was just some idiot that was obsessed with the Dukes of Hazzard. And I pull into this lot where all these camera cars are, and there's these little bitty short buses, yellow school buses, and a bunch of blue Ford Tauruses. And some had the front end knocked off them. One had all 4 wheels off them. And I was like, what on God's green earth? And he's come out and introduced him. I said, all these? He said, movie Road Trip, Sean, William Scott, whatever. And I'm like, yeah. And he said, these are all the Tauruses from Road Trip. There's the short buses. We got to go crush all these things and get paid for these things. I'm like, this guy's awesome. And I go, tell me about the Dukes of Hazzard. Tell me about all this stuff. And he said, well, December 23rd, 1978, I had 51 totaled vehicles after 5 episodes of the Dukes of Hazzard. And I go, what did you do with them all? You know? He said, there's a transmission recycling shop in Dawsonville, Georgia, and his name is Shaw Recycling. And I called Cliff Shaw 2 days before Christmas, 1978, and he came and picked them all up. I said, all of them? He said, all of them. I'm like, well, when was the last time you talked to Cliff Shaw? He said, the 23rd of December, 1978. And I go, it's time for a family reunion. Like, let's go. So sure enough, as if this guy hasn't been entertaining enough to this idiot that's obsessed with the Dukes of Hazzard, After Don Schischler had driven around all these Wagon Queen family trucksters from National Lampoons, he had this terrible black Suburban with a gun turret on the roof of it. And it was from some terrible, terrible Cindy Crawford, Baldwin brother bad guy movie. And this was the Russians of the bad guy car. But that was his car now. So we all get in the terrorist Suburban and head off toward Dawsonville, Georgia. And he's telling us this story that Cliff Shaw and the Shaw family live in this beautiful part of Dawsonville, Georgia, just down the street from Bill Elliott's shop. But there's a nuclear locomotive buried there. And they're the only ones that live on this street. It's either a nuclear plane or a nuclear locomotive, but it is buried at the end of Lumpkin Campground Road in Dawsonville, Georgia, and there's not very many people that live there because of this thing. And I'm like thinking, where on God's green earth is he taking us to? And he knew right where he lived. So we pull up down this hill or down this country road. I mean, you can imagine it in your mind. And up to the left was this gravel road that went up the hill toward this smaller home, but there was cars everywhere as far as the eye could see, all the way up the hill. And from make and model you can think of, older, but just what mythical junkyards are made of, and just trees growing up through them and everything. We're just looking for any remnants of the Dukes of Hazzard. We bang on the door up there. The lady comes to the door and says, hey, Cliff Shaw, blah, blah, blah. Oh, Cliff's not home from work yet. And hey, Don Schischler. And Don, on the way there, he said, look, I'm going to run traffic for you if they say it's here and you just go walking in their yard to see if you can find this thing. We're talking acres. I decided to chime in and say, hey, we're looking for things from the Dukes of Hazzard, of all things. Remember Mr. Schischler here? He was a little family reunion there. And she goes, you looking for the old Dodge Charger car? And I'm like, she could have said a bad guy car. She could have said police car. She could have said Boss Hogg's Cadillac. She could have said anything. But yes, we are looking for the old Dodge Charger car. And she goes, if you walk back down the driveway at the second Pinto, mind you, not the first one, hang a left and start walking in toward the road. And I turned on a video camera, and there is a green 1969 Dodge Charger. And in the first episode of the Dukes of Hazzard, they jumped Lee 1 over Roscoe's police car. And of course, it didn't land well, but the body shop would remove the doors off of it because that kept them from having to paint new 01s on another car. And they remove everything that they can use, but then another episode of the Dukes of Hazzard called for a wrecked race car. So they repainted the first General Lee green and put 71s on it and put John Merende on the roof, which was the transportation coordinator. So I had just found the first General Lee from the Dukes of Hazzard. As I walk around and the door was welded shut on one side and gone on the other side, and it's orange where the door jamb is and the roll cage is still mostly in it. There's a VIN number, which is XP29, blah, 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 any Dodge Charger. And there's a little bitty, label maker. It says LEE1. And then I knew I had found the first General Lee from the Dukes of Hazzard with a Los Angeles parking sticker still on it and all these other things. What do? You are the biggest Dukes of Hazzard moron from any zip code you can come up with. So old Cliff comes home. I heard him drive past me up the driveway, and I'm down there trying to keep my tongue in my mouth going. And this thing is a disaster. It's got more pine needles on it than any national forest you can think of. The motor's in it, the transmission's in it somehow. And it's, still orange where it's supposed to be. It still has a 71. You open up the trunk, and it still has all the concrete in the trunk from when they jumped the car, because it was a big block car, and they jacked it up in the middle of the car, and of course the nose would be heavy, so they put quickcrete concrete in it until it leveled out, and that's how they made ballast in the back of the car. And that's how they flew the General Lees, and that's why they don't land nose first. So I go walking up the driveway, and I just can't believe, of all things, I expected a bad guy car, Cuda truck, anything but the General Lee. I found the first General Lee. So Cliff was interesting. He was a very good old boy, super nice gentleman. I said, hey, Cliff, the old Dodge Charger, the green one down the street. He goes, oh, the General Lee. I'm like, oh, man. I'm thinking that's just some old wrecked race car. He knew it was the General Lee. I'm like, dang. And he goes, oh, the two Roscoe police cars are over the hill. I'm like, oh, you gotta be kidding me. Sure enough, over the hill, past the goats, Roscoe, both police cars, police 1 and 2 sitting there. I come back up, and it was getting a little dark out, and Don had his family reunion with him. He had ran the traffic like he said he was going to for me. And I said, hey, generally for sale? Like, can I take all these out of here? No, the grandson, Cliff's grandson, was into the Dukes of Hazzard. And I'm like going, yeah, but it is a mess. And I said, well, all right, no amount of money. And it's, Travis, you have yourself a safe drive home now, whatever. And so I knew his grandson's name and I knew his address. So I went home and started a little plan on how on God's green earth to get this car. So every 2 or 3 weeks, 2 or 3 months, I would send his grandson something in the mail. A little 3-pack of General Lee cars, Roscoe, Cuda, Enos car, whatever else, sent it in the mail. An autographed picture from John Schneider, sent it in the mail. I'd place a call about every 6 months, and I'd say, oh, we sure do appreciate you sending Zach, sir, loves this, and blase that, and no problem. So after, model kits, and I just put them in the mail. I called his wife one Friday, and I said, hey, did Zach get the Daisy Jeep thing or whatever? And she said, oh, yeah, we sure do appreciate it. He's in there putting it together now, or XYZ. Finally had enough. After about 8, 10 months, a year of doing this, it's time to ask if we can buy the car again. And so I said, hey, I sure would like to come down and talk to Cliff about that car. Oh, yeah, if you're ever in the area, you should come on down, stop on by. And that is my green light that someone has approved me to come down there and talk about that car. And so I immediately called friends in South Carolina, and they had a flatbed roll-off truck, and they didn't live far away. And I had another friend in Chicago. I didn't have a trailer at the time, and I said, I don't care what it takes, just get down here. And this was a Friday, and Friday turned into driving all day and night. Saturday, we pulled down Lumpkin Campground Road, or where the nuclear locomotive is, and here comes Mr. Shaw down the driveway in an Astro van. And this driveway, of course, is up the hill, and it's gravel, and nothing stops well on gravel. It comes to a stop. And I said, hey, Cliff. Hey, June. I'm here to talk to you about this car. And Cliff turned into some guy I didn't know. And I yelled at me like I was his child. And I don't work on Sundays. Who told you to come down here? And I said, well, June just told me on Friday to come down. And she's like, well, yeah. And he's a very religious man, doesn't work on Sundays, not going to have anything to do with some Yankee down there cruising around his property. And I said, well, Cliff, I drove all night, and I really want to talk to you about this car. And he rolled the windows up, and he said, it's buried back there. You can see what you can do. And that was my green light. He didn't know I had a tow truck around the corner. So we moved a whole bunch of cars, and it was raining, and it was on the hill, and it was not good. And we pulled Lee 1 up on a flatbed with big old railroad ties and got it up there and got it out and parked it there at the bottom of his driveway. And it took hours, but he was at church. I saw him coming back down the road, and I don't know if he's going to tell me to fly a kite, get this thing out of here. What are you doing on my property? And he drove right past us and up the driveway. And I'm like going, oh, Mr. Shaw is pissed off. So everybody's looking at me like, what are you going to do? You got to go talk to him, Travis. I'm like, dude, this guy's... all right. So here he comes down overalls, and he said, Travis, I apologize for being so ill towards you today. The NASCAR race is on. Why don't you come up here and sit down and watch this with me, and we'll talk about that car. And he must have got some religion at church, felt bad about it. And I was like going, all right. So I'm like, Mr. Shaw's, and let's go watch a NASCAR race. And we get up there, and an outside TV and box TV and little picnic table. After watching a couple laps of this race, I was like, Cliff, I got a heck of a drive home. I said, I want to talk to you about what I'm going to give you for this car. He said, well, what do you offer me for it? Being the shrewd negotiator that I am, I handed him a pen, and I said, you write a number on your hand, and I'm going to write a number on my hand. And we're going to turn them over, and whatever we're apart, then we know where we're going to start at. And so I had 3 eyes looking over my shoulder on what I was going to write on my hand. And Mr. Shaw, he didn't even think about it. So I wrote $300 on my hand. He could have told me He could have told him he want $30,000 for the car. I had no idea. He rolled his hand over. I rolled my hand over. He wrote $500 on his hand. So I bought the very first General Lee from the Dukes of Hazzard for $400. And then he said, you can have the other police cars for the same money too. So we're talking $1,200 for all of the 3 original police cars from the Dukes of Hazzard. So we took it home. We kept it in its green paint with the 71s, and it was known on the TV show as the Richard Petty wrecked race car. And we kept it like that for a long time. But people started picking paint off of it because they wanted a souvenir from the first General Lee, or picking the roll bar padding. You couldn't take it anywhere because it's painted with lead paint. And Dukes of Hazzard fans letting their kids climb in this thing, and just, 3 of them's probably dead now from being inside that thing. So it was a mess. It was very, very bad. And I had 4 Dukes collectors from Ohio contact me and said, Travis, would you sell the first General Lee? I said, everything's for sale. What would you like? And they made me a good offer. I split the money, true to form, and a man of my word, with my friend from Chicago. He drove a trailer down there and made half. It was no longer my car, and I didn't have to worry about it anymore. Then another gentleman called and said, Travis, I'm in the market for a General Lee because for some reason the mecca of the Dukes of Hazzard was in Indianapolis, and my name was all over every message board, and I had found the first General Lee, and I was arranging all this stuff. But he wanted a real car. And I said, man, there were 17 real General Lees left in the world. They're all in various conditions. They're very expensive. They're very impossible to drive because this is, if you want something to drive and go to your car shows, don't buy it. But he was adamant. About the same time, the guys from Ohio called back and said they'd broken up or whatever and they want to sell the car again. So I called the gentleman in Florida that wanted a real General Lee, and I said, Lee 1's for sale. And he said, give me the phone number. And he called me back. He said, I bought it. They'll have it ready for you. I've already wired their money. You just go to Ohio and pick it up. And I go, I don't want this car back. I mean, what? So he flew in from Florida. I went and picked the car up. We met at the Indianapolis International Airport. He came and saw what he purchased, which wasn't the greatest car in the world. It still looked exactly as it did as I found it in Cliff Shaw's yard. And I said, well, what are you going to do with this thing? He said, well, you're going to restore it. And I said, I have no desire to restore this thing. He said, Travis, if someone painted all over the Mona Lisa, someone would have to fix it, and that someone is you. And I'm like, that's pretty heavy. He took off. His plane ticket was for about 3 hours in Indianapolis to talk me into restoring the first General Lee. This car had fallen out of the sky and landed on asphalt 8,310 days before I found it. The transmission tunnel had caved over the top of itself. It was a disaster, but it still had its transmission, still had its motor, still had a lot of stuff in it. So I started writing checks, and we hired a body shop, found a completely junk but good sheet metal 69 Dodge Charger, saved what we could save off the other one. We actually had the original motor rebuilt. And then we restored Lee 1, but we didn't restore it to showroom condition. We restored it to as it appeared Saturday, November 11th, 1978, when it flew. And the decals were crooked because whoever put the decals on the door that day put them on crooked because they followed the wrong line of the car. And so we went ahead and rebuilt the car. And it ran and it drove and it still had a cracked windshield, and it had a cracked windshield in the show, and the parking sticker was in it. And we had General Lee number 1, again, on the road. The most famous car. It's on every Ertl package of it in the air. It's the only one that had chrome rocker panels for the entire show, and it's there. So we had the car, and we had it for a while. He took it back to Florida for a minute and put it in the DuPont Registry Museum down there, and just really kind of fell out of love with it. So it was time to sell it. He asked if we would represent the car again, which, we have no problem with that, and take it to Barrett-Jackson. And for those of you that have had an experience at Barrett-Jackson, oh boy. And it's going to run up on Saturday on the big night and everything else and whatever else. So my friend Jim went out there to represent the car. And he is, if not equally more knowledgeable about the Dukes of Hazzard than I am. And just a walking encyclopedia. I've learned more from him than I learned from most people that appeared on the show. He's out there representing the car, and I had to DJ. So now, when I say I had to DJ, I worked at a club called Boogie Nights for 9 years. I was a disc jockey for 26. So I have a full afro on, glasses, a Harlem Globetrotters uniform, and it's a Saturday night, and I'm looking at about 1,000 people, and I got this little TV in the DJ booth, and this car is about ready to sell. And he had called me, Jim had called me and said, there's this little guy, well-dressed, nice guy, really interested in this car. And I'm like going, I'll sell it to him, you know, I don't care who he is. It's just, all we need is 2 people to get a bidding war on this thing. It rolls up on stage and it starts flying, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70,000. And this is a disc jockey and a luthier that had just restored a car, and we're up over $100,000. We have no business restoring cars. We are just Dukes of Hazzard fans. The minute it hit $110,000, it hit a wall. It was done. And they are begging for bids, like, as you know, anybody, somebody, give me $10. Like, it was ridiculous. But there was a bid from the Skybox, and that Skybox was the eventual winner. And the minute he put his card up, everybody stopped, and they all got out of his way. And it was so weird to watch it happen. But I bought the car for $400, so I'm up to $110,000 on my $400 investment. Come to find out, it was Bubba Watson. And he does live in Scottsdale, and he's local, but a super nice guy, PGA golfer, just a terrific, terrific guy. And it couldn't have gone to a better person. A lot of people are like, Travis, aren't you upset this thing only went for whatever and it was on a rails? I'm a disc jockey, and a luthier restored the first General Lee, and we're fans, and we just made, the car just sold for $110,000 on my $400 investment. I was dancing in the dance club like the Warner Brothers frog, like I was happy as could be. When the car left and went on, Bubba would email me back and forth just occasionally, and I sent him some videos of when we restored it and shirts and whatever else. But then he would appear on a YouTube channel or another program, and he was able to recite the history of the car. So he was a student of the car, so it couldn't have gone to a better person. And he has since restored some things or done some things to make it his car, because it is now his car, and he is allowed to do anything he wants to with it. So some things I didn't expect was the backlash from the Dukes of Hazzard fans that couldn't believe that I would destroy the first General Lee, that I was going to cut this car all up and rebody it, and it's a replica of the first General Lee, and it's no longer the first car. And I was like going, but it's running and driving on the drivetrain it flew on, and all the sheet metal on it's 1969 sheet metal. So I restored the car, but it's a replica. And so I didn't, and there was just threads and just people pissed off. And I'm like going, oh my gosh. So you remember back in the day, the Statue of Liberty had all the scaffolding all over it. They rebodied the whole Statue of Liberty, but they still call it the Statue of Liberty. So even if you restore it, it's still the same thing. We just destroyed Hollywood history, but it was my $400 investment, and they could have bought it for the same amount of money if they would have found it.
I'm going to be honest with you, I don't enjoy driving the car because they don't fit. So, you know, what's funny is that in the Glossett World headquarters, which is also the detail and design studio for the brand, I have various cars. I am actually pretty private about the amount of cars and what I own, just because people like to build stories of what they think you're worth. And I think, Ed, you've shot some videos to kind of clarify, hey, I love cars. Just because I have these cars doesn't mean I'm uber wealthy, right? And I think that was great that you shared that with the audience. But that being said, I do have one car in particular that's in our facility. It's a 76 Pantera, and if anybody knew anything about the Pantera, so a De Tomaso was a car that had that Italian look and design to it. It carried an American motor, which is typically a 351. Some people had a Cleveland, sometimes had a Windsor. It was a preference. But if you thought about the time of the design of the car, I think outside the Countach and the Miura, these cars were all very unique. Now, this car is probably not the best driving car in the world, but it's the most unique and iconic as far as being ahead of its time in design. And they made different versions of this. And this one that happens to sit in our facility is a GT4. and it's an all steel body. It's a heavy car. The car was found in, I think it was late 2011 or 12. I call it a barn find. It was in the middle of Nebraska. For a friend of a friend, the car had been somewhat restored, but not perfect. It's been repainted. The paint was single stage. It was completely oxidized. It looked like chalky white. It was like an orange color, like a real orange, like a fruit. And I decided to take this project on with a partner of mine to help me create some of the glossite branding and design. His name is Robert Douglas. He's in Seattle now. And when we found this car, it took a lot of time and attention to get the paint to look correct again. And we were afraid that we were probably going to have to do a whole repaint on this car. But thank God to Glossite and some of the technology and polishing abrasives and paint correction, we're able to spend a few months of color sand and polishing it. And the car today looks like it came out of the factory. I personally didn't find it, but my partner, Robert, my graphics guy who helped develop the brand and gloss it and all the graphics, he found the car. He basically wanted me to go through a various amount of work. And the way I kind of got part ownership of the car was that he got sick and tired of Vegas. He had a big graphic design business. He downscaled it. And then he didn't want to spend any more time on the car, nor did he have a place up in Seattle to store the car. I mean, he completely moved. And it's been sitting with me for 5 years. So, of course, I said, obviously this can't sit here. We have to figure something out. It's occupying space. And he said, cool, let's just become partners on the car. And eventually, if you want, we're in discussions now if I'm going to buy the car. And I'm thinking I'm probably going to buy his portion out because I think it's just a cool car. And I think this would be a car that would be great as we grow right now in our brand. We're looking at 25,000 square feet. We're going to build a custom showroom when you come in with glass windows, like you walk in an exotic car dealership, conference tables, TVs. And I think this could be the car that will sit in there to help tell the Glossite story. And I think it's just iconic because it represents everything that we believe in cars and character and personality. So it could be a keeper. We ceramic coated it in 13. And by ceramic coating it, it made it a base coat clear coat because essentially ceramic coating is SiO2, silicon dioxide, and it's harder, 40 times harder than actually urethane. It's very, very tough. So we coated it, and what it did is it stopped the Pantera paint orange from oxidizing. And this has been years. And typically when a car sits inside, whether it's inside or outside in single stage paint, it'll oxidize. The pigments in the paint will actually start to dull. And this car was unique. We left the interior patina, which means that when we found the car, we didn't really want to clean up the interior of the car because it basically showed the character. And the car interior was in amazing condition, but we made the paint on the exterior look absolutely fabulous. It has some aftermarket wheels on it. It definitely doesn't look like a 1976 vehicle. It looks like out of something today that you would see an exotic or supercar. And we love this car because when we have people come into the facility, whether it's our classes or people coming to get work on their cars or people that just want to view our world headquarters, that car sits in the warehouse and it always draws so much attention. And every time we walk outside in the warehouse and you look at the car, it makes you smile because it represents what an exotic car looked like, the design, the character, the personality. It was just different. And today we still have it sitting. So if you ever come to Vegas, and you ever want to come by and visit us, come check out the Pantera. It's very rare, it's very different, and we have a lot of different cars there that you can view. But this is a cool story because I've driven this car many times, and I'm a tall guy like Ed, and I can't say I'm actually comfortable driving this car, but I will tell you that anytime I take it out in public and I do drive it, it always starts a conversation, and they want to know the story behind the car. I think that it could be a keeper forever. There's different cars that I own. There's a GT3 RS Lava Orange that my good buddy, Perrin from Chicago Motor Cars, found me about a year and a half ago. I'm thinking I'm going to keep that car. I've got an 89 Porsche Speedster that my dad and I bought, the Arctic White. And so I think there's a few cars I'm going to keep. The Pantera, I don't know. It's almost like attached and connected to the business because people have identified it. It's in a lot of marketing material. It's been in a lot of video content. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't enjoy driving the car because they don't fit. I feel like a clown in a clown car. Right? It's just, if you've ever been in Pantera, it's really constricted more than a typical, like some of the old Ferraris, right? You remember when you get in some of these old Ferraris, you were like, hey, I love this car, but I can't get in the car, right? So we'll have to see.
And actually, I got passed by a mom in a minivan who did not realize we were racing. I am going to tell you about the worst California Mille entry of all time. The California Mille, in case you don't know, it's this very expensive, very exclusive 5-day high-end vintage Ferrari road rally based out of California. Starts at the Fairmont Hotel. I grew up in this town called Stockton, California. It's the middle of nowhere in California. And unbeknownst to me, growing up in the same town at the same time as this guy, Dick McClure, but we never crossed paths in this town. It was only when we went out and started individually doing these high-end vintage rallies that we ran into each other. And as soon as I met Dick, and as soon as Dick met me, we both realized, like, here's a guy who really appreciates crappy cars, just the same way that I do. And our first event together, Dick built a Mark 7 Jaguar that he had pulled out of a junkyard, and his goal for the build was that nothing on the car could come from any Jaguar supplier, period. So the floors were all rusted out. He got the pickup truck bed from a Toyota Hilux in Pick and Pull, cut it out and welded that in for the floors. The upholstery was all gone, so we went to Beverly Fabrics and got some green tartan. This car was spectacular. And so I thought, you know, Dick and I can do business together. He's my kind of guy. 20 years ago, my friend Dick McClure and I, about 2 months before the California Mille, we were at this warehouse in Oakland, and it was magically full of all of these totally destroyed old cars. And one of them was an early Triumph TR2. I think it was even a long door. It was a small mouth TR2. And we pulled it out, and Dick said, I'm going to enter this car in the California Mille, and if they accept it, I will restore it between now and the event. At this point, it's now 7 weeks away. Sends off the application. And the application includes a picture of Dick standing next to the shell of a junk TR2 saying, I will restore this car. So we get in. So I go off and do other stuff. I don't want any part of this, right? But I show up, I pay my half of the entry fee, and I show up at the start of the California Mille, first thing in the morning, 5 a.m., and I get in the car, I get on the passenger side, and I put my hands on the dashboard, and I leave 8 fingerprints in the paint because it's still wet. It hasn't cured yet. Dick said, oh yeah, don't do that. Like, until tonight, don't touch the car. So we get in the thing, and it's barely held together. It's zip ties, and it's wire, and it's rattling, but it runs, and it looks great. So we take off. It's a 5-day rally. The first day, we made it as far as Mendocino, and halfway through the day, the electrical system completely packed up. But we coasted into a parking lot where there was Kragen, and said to the guy, well, we need a generator for a 1955 Triumph TR3. You know, it's not gonna happen. Cobbled together some generator and made it back up. Second day, we're coming down Oildale. There are some switchbacks. It's a real fast cliff. And actually, I got passed by a mom in a minivan who did not realize we were racing. I knew it. She didn't know it. She creamed me. But as I'm going down, I'm starting to think, well, you know what, Dick? This car's pretty great. Oversteers a little bit. Uh-oh. And the rear wheel passed us on the passenger side, just right down the cliff. So we got that sorted out by the end of the day. The next day, we're heading down south. We're on the Avenue of the Giants. Very spectacular, and there's Ferraris going past us, and Maserati A6Gs, and we're in this horrible little car. And I notice, I'm driving again, and every time I turn left, I hear this weird buzzing noise. Oh, what the hell is it? Don't think much of it. We pull over, we open the hood, and I notice there's these little chips coming out of the fan. It's like rounded out. I'm like, well, how is the cross member moving? That doesn't make any sense at all, but it's hitting the fan. Oh, well, I bolt it back up, keep driving. And I realized about an hour later, and we're hauling, I say, you know, I don't think the cross member is moving. I think the engine is falling out. And exactly at that moment, clang! It absolutely fell out of the car. Dick revealed that, well, I was in a hurry and I didn't have time to actually get the real bolts for this thing. So I was also putting a deck on the back of my house. And so those were bolts from the deck project. So that's probably why they broke. So then we had to put the engine back in. On the last day, for the last dinner, we got it all worked out. We were having a great time. The car's running great. Pull into the parking lot on the final leg. I'm driving again. I don't know why this is always happening to me. And I pull in, stop the car, and I put my hand on the wheel to get out of it, and the entire steering wheel comes off. The hub is still there, and the spokes are still there, but the rim completely came off the car. So the next morning after the big celebratory dinner, and we all survived, and we thought this was the greatest thing ever, Dick is driving the car on I-5 back to Stockton, California, and he's doing about 80 miles an hour, and he just thinks it's the greatest thing in the world. And the hood, which on a TR2 is just held on by 2 little Zeus fasteners, pops up, hits him on the head, gives him a concussion right across here. The hinges at the back start vibrating. Whang! The whole hood flies off the car. Circle, circle, circle. Hits another car in traffic on the way back. Bounces off the side of the road. Dick just, I want no part of that. And my rallying with Dick, in a way, created the 24 Hours of Lemons, because Dick and I were doing all of these events, and we both realized the only time you really had a memorable, incredible, fun week on these events was when everything went wrong. If you got in your car and it just ran like the hammers and you got to the end and you had a glass of wine, well, that seems great at the time, but you don't remember it. You don't have good stories out of it. And the ones where we just had the time of our lives was where stuff was falling off. And the great thing about Dick is with his cars, stuff is always falling off. So we were always having a great time. Now, eventually, Dick and I graduated, and we ran a 1936 MG TA, I think it was a TA, race car. This thing was spectacular. And we start from the Fairmont, and it's pouring down rain, and we're really pleased with ourselves because they start oldest car first. We're like third in line for this event. We get to Van Ness. We're going down Van Ness on our way to the Golden Gate Bridge. In front of us is a Maserati Grand Prix car, pre-war. Spectacular thing, and we're coming down, and Dick turns to me and he says, I can't stop. I said, gee, Dick, well, what do you mean? Because there's a $4 million Maserati right ahead of us, so I think you should stop. He goes, well, I'm trying, but I'm pushing on the brake and nothing is happening. And we're in the fast lanes, 3 lanes of traffic, and like Moses parting the Red Sea, these giant SUVs on either side of us start, we want no part of that. We're getting out of here. And that opens up a hole. And Dick just, and he shoots across 2 lanes of traffic on Van Ness, crashes into the curb. I think he might have mowed over a shrub, stops the car without totaling this Maserati Grand Prix car. Well, it turns out, see, Dick lives in Stockton. Stockton is in the valley. Valleys are flat. He thought the brakes were great. I mean, they're cable brakes, right? And he said, oh, well, they stopped the car. How bad can they be? Well, 3 out of the 4 had been frozen for 20 years. We just didn't know until we got onto a hill. That was an exciting trip.
So 2011, okay, I start getting into buying and selling weird and wonderful cars. And for me, weird and wonderful is basically anything American. Living in England, it kind of sets your scope a bit low. We've got Morris Minors and Austin Minis. As soon as you jump in like a 70s Oldsmobile Cutlass, you know you're having a good time. But there's a couple of things that are completely unobtainable when you're a young man. And GT40 supercars, those kind of cars, have never been within my mists. I've never been able to get my hands on one. And 2011, I met a guy called Mr. Lees, okay, Pete Lees. And he said, oh, my dad's got a GT40. And, as a young man, we didn't really realize that there was real ones and fake ones and replicas. You kind of assumed that a GT40 is a GT40. He showed me a few pictures, and his dad in his garage at home was built this amazing GT40. 302 V8, UN1 Renault gearbox, the same as that goes in like the early Renault 21s and the DeLoreans, that kind of thing. And basically this car had been built on the lowest budget you've ever seen. A gentleman called Ivan, on his evenings and his weekends, went home and used whatever he could to make a car. And from the outside of the car, it was really, really nice. It had like knockoff style wheels. It was perfectly in proportion. But the thing that made it really, really special is it was a Mark III, okay? Because basically in the GT40 world, I've learned this over the last year, you have a Mark I, a Mark II, and a Mark III. And the Mark III was a road-going car, okay? 4 circular headlights on the front, like the 58 kind of Chevy trucks. They had the twin circle headlights on the front. Well, that's the same as the Mark III GT40. And basically, it was a road car, okay? It wasn't like made to go around a track at super speeds. You open the rear body on the car, and basically it had a trunk in the back and cast manifolds with an ugly exhaust that went through the back. This car was made for your everyday use. I asked him, I said, hey man, if you ever want to sell that car, not knowing its true value or not knowing just how it looked, really, I've seen some pictures of it, and I knew that the guy had driven to Le Mans in it. He didn't drive home because it broke down, but he drove to Le Mans in it. So I was like, I want it. So every year, same story, okay? you go around, you take some donuts round, you drop a crate of beer or some nice coffee or whatever, and you just get talking, you know. And slowly after about 2 or 3 years, he allowed me to pull the front of the cover off and have a look. And, you know, a couple of years later, he'd be like, oh, I'm not selling it, leave me alone. And the guy's now in his early 80s or late 80s, early 90s. And I got the phone call. And this is on New Year's Day. Okay. So, you know, I'm trying to have some time with my family. I work 12 hours a day every day. So New Year's Day, my wife's like, what the hell are you doing taking a call on New Year's Day? It's family time. And I wasn't hungover, which is really rare for me because normally New Year's Eve, I'm out of my box. All right. I'm completely unpacked. But on this day, I was completely sober. 9 o'clock in the morning, I get my phone out of my pocket. And I'm like, hello, mate, how you doing? Oh, my dad wants to sell the GT40. I'm like, cool. I'll give him like 20 grand right now. And he's like, no. My dad said, it looks better in pictures than it does in real life. Go see him. But he said there is this other guy who is really interested, who only for the last couple of years has kind of been doing what you're doing. So I don't know if like they kind of like listened to me once when I was talking crap in like an English pub. And I sort of say, hey, if you're going to buy a car, you need to get to know people. You need to show your face a little bit more often so that when they go to sell it, you're the first person on their mind when they're considering taking that leap. He said, oh, for the last 2 years, he's been knocking my dad's door and saying, hey, I want to buy the GT40. But you know what? Because he's been there recently, while his mind is telling him to sell the car, he's kind of thinking of going with this guy. So I was like, look, just send me his bank details. I'll pay him now. There's no way I'm losing this car. Can you phone your dad now, who's like early 90s, and say, I'm going to be there now. I'm going to load the truck up. I'll get some cash. I had to go like 10 different cash points to get like 500, 500, 500, 500. And it's the old English way, all right? 10 grand in the front pocket, 5 grand in this pocket, £1,000 here and there, and 3 grand in the truck. Because, you know, if you're going to negotiate, oh man, I've only got 15 on me. And then you start pulling it out. Oh, let me go see what I've got in the truck. You know, have you got 500 I could borrow? You know, you got to play the game a little. When I got there, I looked at the car and it was rough. Like, I mean, this car got stored 8-9 years ago in a workshop. The doors were off it. The paint was faded. He put a cover over it and the rain really killed the paint. You know, it oxidized. It went kind of white, kind of cracked. And I gave him 18 grand for the car, right? And you know what? Within 10 minutes of owning the car, I didn't regret it because I gave the man a figure that I feel like I wouldn't lose on. But if it was anyone else, I would have bid him in the balls and walked away with it for like 12, 13 grand. But on the same hand, I got something that I can build. And, you know, what I'm trying to do is do it in such a way that it will have this Mark III exterior, which in my opinion is long and beautiful and glamorous. Like, it's got a line, it's so beautiful. A lot of people like the shorter Mark Is and Mark IIs, but I want to do some real nostalgic looks with this car. I want the outside to be period perfect, but underneath I want to have a bit of an animal. So I've gone original aluminium uprights, 4-link on the rear, new upper and lower adjustable rose jointed wishbones, big EBC brakes. We're going original Boreani wire wheels. If some lovely person out there would like to give me a set, I'd love you forever. But on the same hand, I want this car to look aesthetically perfect. But when you pull those covers off, this car is going to be an animal. Okay, we're going to have a 302, but it's going to be a fire-breathing Simon Hicks powered V8. So, you know, we got some cheap Flowtech heads from Summit. And we ripped them all apart, flowed them, ported, polished them, had a match with the intake manifold. We're going to town with a big snake exhaust system that flows into each other. So you get that real supercar roar. This car is going to be something of, you know, it's going to be enormous. It's going to break the GT40 world because you have the purists that want it original. You get the, you know, the guys that kind of throw the rule book out the middle. We're trying to bring those two teams of genres together to build something special, beautiful, but super fast. So when we got the car back to the garage, you know, we looked at it, and this car is built out of parts which you would imagine on your family sedan back in 1982, okay? It had Granada front suspension. And what they did was back in the 80s, okay, when this car was designed, it was designed by a man called Ken Atwell, I believe, which designed a car called the KVA. He used to work at Ford, all right? And when they developed this body, which was the KVA body, okay, he said to Ford, they had a car that was smashed up, a real Ford GT40 Mark III. And the gentleman was like, hey, we need you to repair it. He was a very, very good fiberglass worker. And they said, hey, would you consider making this body perfect for us? You know, would you repair it? And he was known as one of the best fabricators of fiberglass in the world, you know? So Ford commissioned him to repair the original GT40 that was smashed back in the day. And he said, I'll do that. But the deal is, I want to make a mold, an exact mold of the original GT40 Mark III. And this story only came about in a pub in England, okay? So when you've got a man that is known for his exquisite fiberglass work and a high-ranking Ford executive in a pub having a few beers, something crazy comes out of it. A GT40 that I found in a garage after being stored for 10 years. It doesn't really get cooler than that, right? But what you do find is people take molds upon molds upon molds over the years, and some things change, as in the lines. And behind a lot of these GT40s, okay, where the driver's door opens, there is a very small ridge, okay, and it's like a drip rail you'd find in a modern car. And we don't know where that mold has come from. We don't know if Kenneth Atwell was like, this is my, piece de la resistance of him putting his own name on it indirectly or what. There's a very small line on the back of that door which wasn't on the original car. So although this car was taken from the molds of a real GT40, like a really, really rare car, we don't know if he's trying to tweak the edges a little bit to make it very special. But now we're in the build. So I've been building this car 2 episodes a week, taking it apart, and the car is a lot worse than we expected. I mean, the front suspension was 4 bolts and it fell off. Right, it was that bad. The interior is done to a high spec, but it was done on a budget. You got to understand, this guy built it with no money in his shed, and he did a phenomenal job at the time and for his budget. But what we've done is we've thrown quite a lot of that away, and we're rebuilding it into such a way that when this car will be ready for sale, it is going to be a world-class build. It is going to be amazing. But it's the silly things that we're finding that are quite scary. So on the designs back in the 80s when they, developed this car as a kit, the rear trailing arms were designed to come down, be welded at a 45, and then come down. So this arm here, which was welded, if you went over any kind of pothole or anything like that, it would just snap and break. The coolant lines on the car run directly underneath the car, but protrude the lower line. So if you hit any kind of sleeping policeman or bump or anything like that. For sleeping policeman, by the way, in England is what we call a speed bump, right? So they're out to get you, these speeding policemen, I can assure you of that. But, the coolant lines were underneath, so if you went over a bump, you're going to burst them. The interior was designed in such a way that the water pump is basically in your ear, okay? So the engine is behind you, and the water pump protrudes through the firewall to the point where you can kind of feel the reverberation of the belts spinning on your elbow. Like, we're trying to do as much as we can to make this car usable and kind of repairable. Because if that water pump went wrong, before we'd been playing with it, you have to take the engine out. There's no way you could replace it. This car needs to be a car that we can race, maintain, look after, and repair with ease. So people don't understand, okay, that when you buy a Lamborghini, like a fake Lamborghini kit car, buy a Diablo replica or a fake 355 based on a Toyota MR2, okay, these are what you would call in the modern world as a kit car, yeah? But you've got to understand, like Ultima race cars and GT40s, that kind of essence, these cars are designed on the original cars, okay? These cars back in the 60s are exactly the same as what they are today as a kit car. The GT40 kit cars are a fiberglass body on a monocoque chassis with, a big whacking great V8 in the back. These cars, if built right, done to the right specification, you can drive your car to Le Mans via McDonald's. There was a very classy picture out there of a gentleman going through McDonald's in his Le Mans car, okay? You can drive it to Le Mans, and you can actually apply to be in a class with original race cars of the 60s if it's built right. The original GT40s were just a load of parts thrown together by a load of very special, amazing people. And nowadays you've got the Ford versus Ferrari film, which really gives you a feel of how crazy it was back then and how easy it was to go from the top to the bottom by a few modifications that someone came up with in a shed. You got to understand, when this car was built, it was based upon that love and that feel of being a race driver and actually being able to build it in your shed. When, Ford developed the Cobra and then they built the GT40, that was the same idea. How can we put the Cobra running gear that's in the front of a car in the back to give us better weight distribution and actually maybe be able to put that traction down a little bit better on the back and compete with other people? Well, it's a bunch of car guys in a garage, like-minded, car-loving people building something that they think will change the world. And they did. the problem I have, right, is being hard up. Yeah, I live in a government property in the UK, spend my whole life building and buying and selling the cars I love. Okay. But what I've found over the years is the transition between buying, a fake Lamborghini to a GT40 normally results in me having to sell that Lamborghini because I don't have the money like most people with affinity budget to go, hey, I'm going to go buy, a Lamborghini, a Ferrari, a Murcielago, and a Bugatti. Like, I don't have that kind of like bankroll, But since my life changed through COVID, I'm at the point where I'm selling cars, I'm making money. And if I do this right and I build this car to the spec I want, this may be the car that I can just never, ever.
I actually ended up consulting a friend of mine who's a Catholic priest about this, to which he responded, finders keepers. So in my line of work repairing vintage Mercedes, sometimes I end up damaging parts, and so I was rebuilding the steering box in a 300 SEL 6.3 and I ended up damaging it. Meanwhile, my girlfriend had located through just a post on Facebook or something, a pair of Mercedes that were delivered to a wrecking yard near me. And so this is a real travesty. I mean, I would love to sit down and tell stories of these cars getting rescued. So it was like horrifying for me to see these two beautiful cars, a 280 SE 4.5 and a 300 SEL 4.5, both 1972, in a wrecking yard, especially when they looked fairly complete. Now, they weren't as complete as I thought. By the time I got there, I could tell that some assholes had cannibalized what would have probably been two restorable cars. But I had gotten to the point where I was so desperate for a steering box, I said, okay, I'm just going to remove the steering box. It doesn't involve cutting up the car or anything. I'm just going to take the steering box out, take it back to my shop, and then deal with rebuilding it. I have this helper, or I had this helper named Dean Snyder. And Dean was not really a very well-adjusted guy. He was from what Chief Keef calls Sosa, or the south side of Chicago. He could not say a sentence without dropping an F-bomb. And he had a very hard time explaining himself because instead of speaking slowly and coherently, he would just kind of talk like this, like he was sort of mumble his way through everything, you know what I'm saying? It's like a Chicago version of Boonhauer from King of the Hill. He had this just awful disposition of getting in trouble. And so I said, on a day like today, I have a bad feeling about leaving him at the shop. So, I'm just going to bring him to the wrecking yard with me. And maybe a car will fall on him and he wouldn't die, but I'd just sort of leave him there by accident. So we go into the wrecking yard, we finish pulling the steering box. We test drove a customer's car out there, 1984 Mercedes 190D 2.2, fabulously reliable, but also extremely slow. And this thing was just fresh out of somebody's backyard. So we'd gotten it running and we're driving it to see if it has any major problems. And as you can expect, we didn't have a valid license plate on it either. So that was doubly stupid of us. We go to the wrecking yard and Dean says, hey, we should look in the trunk of this car. You know what I'm saying? There might be something interesting in there. And let me translate that for you. Hey, P, we should look in the trunk of this car. There might be something interesting in here. So I grabbed a little pry bar and I fiddled with it and I got the trunk popped. Inside the trunk, I saw a bunch of stuff, and I was like, I don't know what this is. I'll just let Dean look at it. I'll keep him busy. So I'm getting a couple other little items that I need, and Dean calls me and he goes, hey. And when he says it like that, I know that he's excited. So I crawl up over two cars to the top of the stack and look in the trunk, and there are all these purple boxes, and there are a couple of vinyl bags that are long that look like you would store a gun in. So I start looking at the purple boxes and I open them and I go, that's funny. I don't know what these are, but they look kind of valuable. And it turns out that they were Silver Eagles. And there were 40 of them, all with their certificates in the trunk. There were also 3 shotguns and 6 boxes of ammunition. and one virgin, never used Mercedes-Benz Bosch D-Jetronic electric fuel pump, which you can't buy anymore. So, of course, I told Dean, what are we going to do with all this stuff? We need a plan to smuggle it out of the wrecking yard. So our immediate plan was this. Immediately behind the wrecking yard, there was a canal. On the other side of the canal was a service road that was only open to city vehicles, but the 190 was small enough so that we could kind of drive around the gate. So I had Dean drive the car around the gate and park in back of the service road. The next thing we did was we loaded up all of the goods onto the trunk lid of the car, which I removed, and we promptly ushered them through the wrecking yard discreetly while we were carrying them and started slipping them through a hole in the fence. Now, I don't advise anybody to do this, but Dean could not get one of the guns through a hole in the fence, so he threw it over. But after sitting for 30 years, it did not go off, thank God. Our next plan was getting through the canal. As you could probably imagine, you don't want to go wading waist deep in a canal in Florida because you could get bitten by just about any horrible thing from flesh-eating bacteria to a water moccasin. What we ended up doing was taking a set of contractor bags, putting them over our legs. And so we were able to put the guns and the silver and the ammunition in the 190D, along with all of the other parts that we purchased, which we didn't steal. We actually legitimately purchased the parts, but it's sort of a gray moral area. What do you do with found booty? I actually ended up consulting a friend of mine who's a Catholic priest about this, to which he responded, finders keepers. So finally I was able to sort of clear my conscience of it, but we loaded everything up into the car and then we drove it to my shop. Now, Dean and I had to split the goods, and the idea was that he would keep some of the stuff and I would keep another portion of the stuff. But because Dean is from the hood and he values being able to shoot someone over being able to purchase something, he asked for the guns almost immediately. I said, here, you could have the guns. I decided that I was going to give him one Silver Eagle and take the other 39 for myself. We have a saying that I think as a Christian, a lot of people can relate to, and that is that God is just. So maybe because I tried to screw Dean out of his share, or because I didn't think Dean would appreciate his share, something mysteriously happened. I put the silver in the trunk of my 1970 Mercedes 280 SE Coupe. And I locked the trunk and I said, oh, nobody saw me do this. Everything will be fine. And I hid Dean's guns in the attic of my shop because I said there's no way that he's going to want to crawl up here and look around. It's just too hot. But a month later, I go back to check on my silver, which I was sure nobody saw me hide, and it was all gone. In the meantime, Dean managed to find the guns, took them to his apartment complex, and left the door unlocked while he was storing them in there and got them stolen from him. So the moral of the story is that there is probably a higher power in the universe somewhere that will take what you have taken if it has not been taken fairly or justly. And now I only have a trunk lid left from the 300 SEL 4.5 and a very nice, yet still unused Bosch D-Jetronic electric fuel pump.
I didn't realize cars could deteriorate that badly inside. The car business is a long game. You develop a client base, you figure out a specialty, and to really make it over the long run, you have to do deal after deal after deal. Car brokers tend to try to retire off of their next deal perpetually. So when you get a call to purchase an entire collection, you get a little bit excited. Now, I've tempered that excitement over the years because I found that anytime I get offered a $1 million plus car, often there's too many people involved trying to retire to make it not worth my while. And anytime I get offered a large collection, there's usually 300 other people that have been offered that collection or know about it somehow, such that unless I am the high bidder or get there first, then there's not much to be gained from that either. So I tend to focus on the day-to-day, my GT3 business, and the existing clients that I have, essentially just moving forward one deal at a time. However, I'll still pursue those opportunities because every now and then they do come to fruition. And when they do, it's a nice bonus. So when one of my customers, who's also the Ferrari Club president, gave me a call and said, "Hey, I think there's this vintage Italian car collection down in Kentucky that can be bought. The owner passed away. It's being sold through the estate. Pretty sure it can be bought for $75,000. I was like, "Okay, I'm listening. What's in it?" And he started to list off the cars, except he wasn't entirely sure what was there, but he said, "Well, it's really just, a bunch of kind of older, obscure Italian cars. I'm not exactly sure, but, I knew the guy. He brought this car to a show. He brought that car to a show. Here's what I think is there." I said, "Okay, well, get me the full list if you can." So he sent me the list, and I'm looking at this going, all right, there's some interesting stuff here. There's a Ferrari 400i, a Maserati Miura SS, and, a vintage Maserati Quattroporte. But then there's also just a bunch of random stuff, Maserati 3200 GT and a Maserati bi-turbo and a couple La Fondas or La Forzas or whatever they're called, and some really random stuff. The stuff that nobody knows about because everybody forgot about it for a reason. And I'm like, all right, I have no idea what the heck these cars are worth because my specialty is not forgotten Italian mediocrity. So I called my friend Dan to help me out with it because he loves that kind of obscure stuff. And so together we put a ballpark estimation on the value of the collection, and we figured, well, worst case scenario, it's probably about $130,000. Best case, it's probably $200K. I'm like, all right, well, this is worthwhile. If I can buy it for 75 grand, I'm going to make the trip. So I talked to the attorneys for the estate and arranged a meeting within the next couple of days because obviously if it's that good of a deal, it's not going to stay quiet for long. So I went down to Kentucky to see him. I quickly found out I was not the only person they had shown the collection to, that there were a couple other people that were viewing it. I wasn't necessarily surprised, but I was a little bit disappointed because I thought I was the first one in. But they wouldn't divulge details, of course. So I had no idea what I was bidding against, and they wouldn't even give me an idea of what it could be purchased for. They said, well, you need to make us an offer. So I started looking around the collection, and it was disappointing, to say the least. Now, while I was expecting mediocrity, what I think I actually found was Ed Bullion's grandfather's estate sale. So I started going through these cars, and there is some junk. But it ran the whole gamut. So there was a 1964 Maserati Quattroporte in pretty awful condition. There was not one, but two Maserati Miura SS's in decent condition. There's a Ferrari 400i 5-speed, which was probably the pinnacle of the collection in a very desirable color as well. But it went downhill from there. There were Maseratis and other Italian cars that I weren't even sure what they were. There was a bidder. Does anybody even know what a bidder is? There was a Maserati bi-turbo that had been wrapped in camo. And I think it was not to disguise itself from predators, but to hide the rust that you could see bubbling up underneath the camo. There was some random Cadillac or some vintage American car. They all look the same because they're big and have lots of chrome, and I just don't care because I'm not going to put a tiger on the air cleaner and go to a car show. So I don't know what that was, but I figured it was worth more than $2,000. And outside there were a couple La Forza SUVs in pretty terrible condition, but somebody had cared about them at some point because one of them had a whole bunch of interior modifications and some just gaudy upholstery. There was another shell, I think, for a vintage Maserati coupe, and then there was a wrecked Maserati Cambio Corsa. I don't think there was anything left worth salvaging on it, and I'm not sure that the one inside that was complete was in much better shape than this one either. So it ran the whole gamut of odd and disgusting and mildewy and moldy, but there was certainly some value there. I felt like I was wandering around one of these dealerships like Gullwing Motor Cars or something that sells shells and restoration projects and rust buckets, but this was a guy's old collection. So I took a bunch of pictures, made a bunch of notes, and started getting some ideas together. Now, with the help of Dan doing the research, I found out that some of the cars had some real significance. The Ferrari 400i had won a couple Ferrari events, and the 64 Maserati Quattroporte was actually a very famous car that had been shown in Europe a few years prior and was like a Geneva show car or something like that. It had some real history. But the crazy thing was, literally only about 3 years prior, it was in perfect condition. And in this guy's garage, it had just rusted, rotted out. It probably didn't run. I mean, it was awful. It needed a complete restoration in just a span of 3 years. The guy probably had health issues, and unfortunately, the cars were stored very, very badly, and they all just went downhill quickly. I didn't realize cars could deteriorate that badly inside. Maybe he plowed the driveway with them or used them as salt trucks or something before he put them away. Now, the attorneys wanted to know how quickly I could move these cars out of here. Because essentially they said, well, you have to buy the whole lot, but we have an offer on this Maserati Miura SS, so we have to take that one out of the equation. I was like, well, that's one of the 3 good cars. Well, no, we think we have that one sold. Like, all right, fine. So I got to factor in the cost of removing all of this junk out of the front yard. It was like an Italian redneck's paradise, but if it was Maine, I would have expected to find washers and dryers and lawnmowers out there scattered along with the rusted out pickup truck shells. So I had to factor in the cost of all this, plus the time and just getting all of the cars out of there. I'm figuring I probably have 5 to 10 grand just in transport costs and disposal costs to get these cars out. I think there's still plenty of margin, and I think for, a week or two worth of work, I can, probably double my money on this. So then I got a brilliant idea. I said, well, what's the fun of making money if we can't make something interesting out of it? Because this is a story waiting to happen. This collection is nuts. This is way more interesting than a modern collection of actually decent cars that, everybody and their brother has laying around in warehouses. So I called up Ed. I said, what do you think about coming up to Kentucky for a few days, bringing Rob Pitts with you, and we can be the disposal crew for this collection. And I'll get a camera crew or you get a camera crew, and we'll film a pilot of us essentially discovering this collection and having to dispose of it within a week, because we had a very real deadline that these cars had to be out of there within a certain amount of time if they accepted our offer. Ed was game for the idea because he loves shrewd negotiations. I think Rob Pitts likes selling anything that he can make money on. And so we had ourselves a TV show in the making. So I'm looking through the docs on this Ferrari 400i. And the registration was for a 412. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense. Well, no big deal. He probably just, switched plates or whatever because he was lazy. So I pressed the attorneys on this. I said, hey, do you have a title for this car? Because the plates that are on it don't match the car. And they essentially gave me some sort of political answer that was like, well, what's with the cars is what's for the car. I said, okay, well, no, I really need to know, do you have a title for this car? And they didn't. I'm like, well, that's a problem. So I started doing some investigation into the VIN in Kentucky to see if it had ever been titled there. It had not. I had Dan help me out with some sleuthing, and essentially it appeared that he had just bought the car, never gotten the title, and decided to just swap plates from a 412 that he had owned because he had never got the title. Why he didn't, I don't know. But essentially, I had to treat it as a stolen car or one with no value. So that certainly changed the negotiations. What was a screaming deal, even at $100,000 or $120,000 for the collection, became not so much at all, because when the one car that was probably half the value of the entire collection didn't have a title, that made the proposition far less interesting. So I modified my offer. And then they said, well, that Miura SS is probably sold. So I modified my offer again. And I think I got down to about $60,000 because they wanted to know how much the difference was on the 400, I said that probably takes about $40,000 out of the whole equation. And initially I had offered about $100,000 for the whole lot. So I got down to about 50 or 60 grand for what was left of the collection. Of course, it was all the undesirables. I'm like, man, this isn't even good. I'm not going to get a good car to rep out of this whole thing. It's just going to be me getting rid of a bunch of junk. And I figure we'd be down there for about a week, get a hotel, and just friggin' plow through all these cars, make phone calls, and just get them gone. My wife was not a big fan of the idea of me being gone for a week, but I said, honey, if I can make $20,000, $30,000 in a week and maybe get a TV show, you know, not a bad deal. But they had another offer on the table that was better, and they could not produce the title for the 400, and I did not win the bid. And I'm not going to say that I really was sad about that, because that's one of those offers that you put in going, I really kind of hope that you don't take this because I'm not sure that I want this opportunity. The fun of the car business is that it's a long, slow slog, that nobody's going to retire off of their next deal, and that usually when opportunities present themselves that seem good enough to retire on, they aren't, because there's always some sort of a backstory. And that was certainly true in this case. If the collection itself wasn't enough of a backstory, the logistics contained within were enough to make any legitimate buyer run away.
How much do you think Winn-Dixie spent on that 9-year sponsorship to make a $4,000 motor?
I think the first year was $900,000. And I think over the period, it probably exceeded somewhere around $12 million.
In exchange for a few $1,000s worth of labor.
Well, I was happy. He was happy. I found in a South Carolina junkyard in 1976, ex-Denny Holm Brabham BT8, 2-liter sports racer. It had won the Tourist Trophy, had been undefeated in under 2-liter racing. It had been traded to a guy in Greenville, South Carolina for a Volkswagen and a pickup truck, and ended up in the foreign car repair shop junkyard. And I bought it for $2,900, and I restored it, and I raced it for about 12 years. And it was a fabulous race car. It was very nimble, it was quick, had a little 2-liter Coventry Climax engine, probably putting out 180 horsepower. Car probably didn't weigh anything, I don't know, maybe 1,100 pounds. I began thinking that these cars were pretty lethal in their days. You would lay down between 2 11-gallon tanks of gasoline. If someone ever T-boned you, you were going to have a bad afternoon. The coolant ran through the chassis rails, to save weight. They'd put the radiator in the front, they'd make a chassis rail, and they'd just hook the hoses up. So, you have corrosion over the years. Business had taken a downturn, and I needed to pump some cash into it, so I sold it. I also had a Shelby King Cobra I pulled out of the same junkyard, which was a Cooper Monaco with a 289 Ford V8. That was kind of a funny story. Bob Aiken and I had driven a Jack Roush car in the 24 hours of Nelson Ledges. And I had told Jack Roush I was restoring this Cooper Ford. It was an old Shelby car. And it had a 289 Ford engine with 4 downdraft Webers. And it was connected up to a Kaladi T37 gearbox. The car would kill you just looking at it. Not that the looks were good. It was good. It was designed by Peter Brock. But the car was lethal. Skinny tires, big engine. The chassis was designed for a 2-liter, 180 horsepower engine. Now we got, 350 horsepower engine. Jack Rouse says, send me the motor, I'll build it for you. I said, I can't afford you. He says, you can't afford not to send me that motor, send me the motor. So I sent the motor to Jack Rouse. A crate comes in a few weeks later, and it is a freshly dynoed 289 Ford with a bill for something like $4,000. I call him up and say, I owe you a lot more than this. And he says, nah, you paid cost on the parts, and I billed out the assembly and dyno time to Ford, so enjoy your motor. So I said, I need to do something for you, Jack. No. I said, no, Jack, I want to do something for you. No. And he was just getting ready to go into NASCAR. He hadn't started NASCAR yet. He'd been running sports cars, came out of drag racing. And he says, well, I'm going NASCAR racing. Find me a sponsor. So I called Dan Davis up, who was chairman of the board of the Winn-Dixie grocery chain. And I said, let's have lunch. Went to lunch, and I said, Dan, Daytona 500's coming up, and Food Lion and Publix both have cars sponsored in the Daytona 500, which is right in your market, Jacksonville, Daytona. And I said, Winn-Dixie should have a car, and I have a friend of mine who's just getting into NASCAR, and he's looking for a sponsor. His name is Jack Roush. He said, well, I've always wanted the board to approve this, but I've had trouble with it. I said, well, see what you can do. So he called me a few weeks later and says, yeah, I think we got a deal put together. Can you get this Mr. Roush to come down? I said, yeah. So I called Jack up. I said, I think I got you a NASCAR sponsor. He says, you're joking. I said, no, I got one. Winn-Dixie. And the way it works a lot of times, you'll see the name like the Coca-Cola 600, where in a lot of cases, Coca-Cola or the Winn-Dixie 400, so the Coca-Cola doesn't put the money up. Winn-Dixie gets their name on the race because they give Coca-Cola so many inches of shelf space at 300 or 400 stores at eye level. So there's a bartering that goes on. So in this case, it was the beef people. Winn-Dixie always billed themselves as the beef people. So the beef industry, or the association, was going to do the Beef People's Express. It had a silhouette of a cowboy with a lariat and bulls running along the side of the car. So Jack comes down, and we're in the office of the advertising agency, and Jack's sitting there, and he's nodding and nodding. He says, I need to talk to you. I said, okay, can we go out in the hall? I said, yeah. We go out in the hall. He says, look, I told you to get me a NASCAR sponsor to blow you off and just make you go away because you were insistent about doing something for me, and I didn't need anything done. I said, well, I got you a NASCAR sponsor. What are we going to do? He says, well, I just signed a deal with Folgers, and I don't have enough people to do a two-car team. But would they consider, Winn-Dixie considers, sponsoring Mark Martin in the Busch Series? And that's how the Winn-Dixie deal went together. It went for, I think, 9 years. And Mark Martin won the series with it, with the Winn-Dixie Ford. So this racing community is pretty tight. If someone does you a favor, you always want to pay it back. And you don't ask what the payback's going to be. You just do it for them. And that was a very satisfying moment in my life because I figured, well, maybe this is something I have a knack for. And Jack called me a few months later. He says, I want to hire you. I said, oh, that's nice, Jack, but I'm happy in Jacksonville. Got a little family company. I don't want to live in Detroit. He says, well, if you're ever looking for a job, you call me. I said, okay. I took the car to Sebring the first time when we finished it. And I went there because if something goes wrong, you got a long way to go before you hit something. And I kept getting out of that car in a cold sweat. I took it to Mid-Ohio. And I decided that if I continued in this car, I would be a dead person. It had terrible aerodynamics. In fact, although it was designed by Peter Brock and he and I are friends, I kind of skewered the car in an article and got a nasty letter from him saying that I didn't know what I was talking about. Well, the guy who originally drove the car and the best finish it ever had was fourth at Riverside in the USRRC race, driven by Ed Leslie. And I called Ed Leslie right after I finished it. I said, I just finished your car. And I drove it for the first time. He said, what'd you think? I said, scared me to death. He said, me too. So then later, they redid the car, added a spoiler in the front and in the back, and John Morton drove it at Monterey. And John and I are friends. I said, well, John, how's the Lang Cooper? He said, scared me to death. I said, well, that's three of us. It was built in '64, and that's when American V8s started being put into European chassis, and whether it was a Lotus 19 or a Cooper Monaco, they were shoveling in Chevys, Buicks, and Fords. And those chassis just couldn't take the kind of torque. And that chassis was brazed, it wasn't welded. So every time we took it out, there were cracks to mend. And I just said, yeah, this makes sense. I sold the car and made tremendous money on it. I didn't miss it. The Brabham I missed, because it was a good driving car. The Lang Cooper I didn't. The car that was the most fun to drive, I had it for 28 years and just sold it 2 years ago to Adam Carolla, was the X Group 44 Triumph TR6. That car was trick. When they built it, the rules allowed for safety changes. So that car had Mercedes-Benz half shafts. Everything had been acid dipped. All the weight had been moved around. It was a fully developed race car. And for a car with a cast iron 2.5-liter pushrod engine, it had a lot of torque. It was easy to drive. It was like putting on an old shoe. You get in, just turn the wheel, and it had no bad habits. It didn't oversteer. It didn't understeer. It was all neutral. And the only reason why I sold it, I raced it 28 years. I was at the race at Amelia Island on the airport, and Ray Evernham came over for the race, along with Tommy Riggins, Great local driver. And I say great local driver, not great local. He lived in Jacksonville, but a great driver. Won the Kelly Series. Really, really good. And they came up to me after the race and said, we don't want to see you driving this car anymore. I said, why? He says, you got a single roll bar, just like 1971. You got that little tiny bucket seat that only comes up the middle of the back. If you get in real trouble, you're going to die in this car. And I'd had a pretty good offer from Adam Carolla because he collected Paul Newman cars. And this car went from Group 44 to Paul Newman. So I sold it. But one of the funny stories was we keep a few cars around the Concours office. And we had a group of teenagers around one day, and I was showing them the cars. They said, well, this is a 57 Cadillac Eldorado convertible, and this is a 58 Cadillac Eldorado Brougham, and in hallowed tones, I said, and this car, this very car, is the car that Paul Newman won his first national championship in. This little girl, about 13, looks at me and says, the guy that makes the salad dressing? I said, yeah, that's him. I wondered in the last few months when that Steve McQueen Bullitt Mustang sold for $3.8 million, if 20 or 30 years from now, anybody's going to know who Steve McQueen is, and whether the car's going to be worth $3.8 million. Fame is a fleeting thing,
French racing Cuda, what the hell does that mean? A few years ago, we had an associate of ours contact us over in Europe. And every so often, we have a counterpart of good friend relations overseas. If they come across a car that's got a great story, they call us first. And one day, we got a phone call from one of our counterparts over there and said, listen, I've got a real American car for you, like heavy French accent. Okay, great, yeah, so I guess it'll be right up our alley because we're American guys, thanks, Romeric. And it was a Hemi Cuda, but this Hemi Cuda was in a barn, like most of these crazy cars that have epic stories are. It was stuffed in a barn that was in the hillside of France, in an area known as kind of like gypsy occupied location. And it was the gypsy Hemi Cuda. It was like eggshell white. It had these big center lock BBS gold basket wheels on it. 1970 Hemi Cuda. For those that don't know, the Hemi Cuda out of the 1970s, early 70s is like the pinnacle of all muscle cars. So this very iconic car was over in France. And it's not typical that you have a very iconic American car over in France. Did a little more research with our associate, and he said, you know what, I think this might actually be the French racing Cuda. The French racing Cuda, what the hell does that mean? The Chrysler X-Works race car that Chrysler had owned and shipped over to Europe for their attempt at European racing. Now, for those that don't know, European racing in its entirety is much larger than our racing over in the United States. And this car was supposedly in or around France at that time and going to these events. More than not, it was a Porsche or Renault or a Peugeot or a BMW, something that raced in these hillside events that were successful. The small cars, the narrow roads, the hill climbs, power to weight ratio, not this big, burly, nasty, big block American muscle car. So we start doing some more research and we find out it won four Group A championships. It won got 68 podium finishes. Said, all right, well, I guess it's time to pitch it to a client. This is one of these great investment moments. So I pitched it to a client and said that, hey, listen, this is the Chrysler X-Works Hemi Cuda. People are like, okay, yeah, well, what does that mean? You tell them a little more about the car. And you're like, hey, listen, yeah, Chrysler used to own this damn bad boy. They sent it overseas and they raced it for, I believe it was 200 and something races. It was killing it over there. We put more pieces to the puzzle. The original race car driver was still alive. And he was doing well. He was noted as the Carroll Shelby of France. Henri Chemin. Everyone over there knew him. He was like Mr. Mustang. He was Mr. Hemi Cuda. Him and Carroll Shelby were actually really good friends. He drove this car everywhere, from the racetrack to the supermarket. This was his daily car. Like, no one else could get behind the wheel of this automobile but him. So the car was shipped back over after we'd done a lot more due diligence on the history. And the owner of the car was so psyched about it. However, we're just hearing bits and pieces of the story. We don't know if it's for certain if this is the car. It's got different wheels on it. It's got a different paint scheme on the vehicle. It's now an eggshell white. It never raced in this color. It was supposed to have some big elaborate livery on the car, and it was raced and sponsored by CB and Shell gasoline at one time, and nothing what it resembled currently. As the documentation had started, the actual build of the car, the hands-on aspect, there were some cameras and there were some guys that worked for Speed Vision at that time, and also another station, Velocity. The gentleman behind the camera was that of Bill Stevens. He's there behind the camera and he's kind of doing a little commentary, and he's like, hey, listen, I guess we just gonna start buzzing this thing down. We got a call from Henri. We asked him some questions. He told us exactly how the car was in its winningest livery, its most winningest colors. It was supposed to be white and blue, and then they painted it red and white at one time. If we don't find any of these colors underneath it, it's going to make it much more harder for me to prove this to a client. Stripping the car down, and on camera, there's the red and the white. We're like, holy shit, it is the f***ing race car. You've got to be kidding me. And this car had been off the radar for the better part of 30 to 40 years. No one had seen or known its whereabouts. Everyone was looking for it. We decided to do a full-blown restoration on it, every single nut and bolt off. We go through the entire process, document every single step all the way through. From the restoration of the engine, the paint work, the new color scheme. We're talking to the old race car driver overseas. He's telling us exactly what bolts have to go where. The seat belts that he had at that time, and how the steering ratio was in the box, and the feel that he had, right down to small things like stickers on the door jamb that said export by Chrysler France. Now it comes time to reunite the Hemi Cuda with the original race car driver. He hadn't seen the car in quite some time after the Gypsy Camp had owned it and painted and done its own thing. I greet him at the front door, him and his wife. He walks through the shop. I've got a car cover over the vehicle. Bill Stevens is over there from Velocity. We got a couple cameras rolling. This is going to be epic. Pull the cover off, and sure enough, he almost fell over backwards. He was floored. The car was done exactly the way that he remembers it, like down to the T. He goes over to the driver's side and checks the door handle, and on camera, and it was like, this was the real first reaction of him seeing the car. He goes to pull the handle, and the car was locked. I didn't even know how the car locked. I don't even think the thing had strikers inside the door. It was a race car at that time. I think they were probably deleted. And it was locked. We're like, you got to be kidding me. So cut the camera, go back to the car, got the door to open. He gets in the car, does a little song, dance, speech, everything. He starts crying. He signs the dashboard. He's psyched. We're happy. We won. The owner's happy. The XXX owner, race car driver's happy. This is beyond a win-win situation, much more than we could ever predict. A couple months later, they want to finish up all of the videography work and the right story on the car. They said, well, we've got to ship the car over to Europe and race it at one of the old tracks where he was known for hammering at the corners, and one of the circuit events, because the car had to excel very well on track as well as off-track hill climb. So we get over to Paul Ricard, and it's 25,000 euro to rent the track for the day. We do the garage setup, we take the photographs, everything's hunky-dory. He goes to get behind the wheel. We find out his license is expired, his racing license. So we're like, f it. Everyone there at the track knows he's like a hero, he's an icon. They just let it slide. He goes to put the seat forward, it stops. Like, okay, yeah, well, it's all the way forward. What's wrong? The guy had shrunk about half a foot over the last 40 years, and his feet didn't reach the pedal anymore. So we had to build a wooden block setup underneath his foot, tie it and tape it to his feet so we can get out on the racetrack. Mind you, we just finished this car. We've got probably 2,500 hours of blood, sweat, tears, research, development, and here we are about to just throw the keys to this old guy that's in his 80s to go blasting wide open around this racetrack. Why not? I was too short. We made the block. He got in the car. And he's taking a couple parade laps. Everything's going well. And then he really starts opening up the throttle. And he's coming down the stretch. He's doing 120, 130, 140. We're all looking at each other like, oh my God, we've got to make it to the Greenwich Concourse next month. This thing better not hit the rail. Thankfully enough, he didn't. He actually drove phenomenally well for his age and being his license expired. It was definitely a white knuckle adventure at the racetrack, watching a car that you put your heart and soul into. It'd be like you building your Supra, your GTR, your Corvette, and handing the keys to your grandmother to go around a racetrack at full throttle. I mean, the experience was epic. It was an emotional roller coaster, to say the least. We all made it out alive. It was definitely an epic story, to say the least.
And it was literally in the middle of someone's junk pile. So everybody always asks me, how do we find all the crazy cars at Curated? And I'd like to say it's a mixture of contacting old collectors. It's a mixture of Googling different things. It's a mixture of a variety of almost everything. I mean, from Instagram to cold calling people. I mean, recording VIN numbers, reaching out to former owners. Sometimes you stumble upon something or maybe it shouldn't be. So it was about probably 4 years ago. I'm searching on eBay one day for Lamborghini stuff. We love Lamborghinis. We specialize in vintage Lamborghinis. And I was just looking randomly for, I don't know, it could be old Countach wheels or Miura tires or whatever it could be. And I see a little ad for a Lamborghini Miura SS. There's no such thing as a Miura SS, but it intrigued me, so I clicked on it. But then when I looked at the photos, they were actually too small, so I couldn't even see what the photos were. Like, you could barely make out. There was some sort of car. It was like an orange in color. But apparently whoever uploaded the photos to this eBay ad, like, had a maybe extremely low pixelation, something. So I'm looking through the eBay ad, and there's like almost no description. It says 1967 Lamborghini Miura SS, super duper rare car, like one-off, and it was a very poor description. It almost actually looked like a scam. But then I noticed something, and I noticed that in the area for VIN number, it had a bunch of zeros, but then in the description, it said VIN is, and it was a 4-digit number. And quickly I realized that all Miuras have 4 digits in their VIN. They had chassis numbers, so it's like 5024 or 3606 or something along those lines. So I said, maybe this isn't a scam. So I took a picture of the eBay ad to remind myself later I was doing something else. And I ignored it and went about my day. That night, I realized, I'm going to see that eBay ad again. I'm going to go reach out to the guy. I'm going to message him. It's gone. It was taken down. So I quickly went back to my screenshot of my photo. I found the username. I went, contacted the user, and I got a little message back. And in that message, it said, yes, I've got this Miura SS for sale. It's my boss. It's a one-off car, blah, 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 blah. It's sitting in a barn. So I basically gave the guy my information. I said, please contact me. I'm super interested. So the next day I get a call from a gentleman. Sounded like a very sophisticated guy, but he was destroying the description of this car. He's like, I got this Miura SS. It's got this and that. And he's describing a car that actually doesn't exist. And I asked him, I said, hey, do you have obviously a cell phone that takes photos or anything like that? Okay, great. Can you take some photos of the car and just text them to me? I don't need professional photos. He goes, yeah. He goes, it's at my boss's barn. Give me a few hours. I'm going to drive to his barn and I'll send you the photos. Again, I go about my day. A few hours later, boom, I get a message on my cell phone and I look and it's photos of a Miura. I almost fall over because I honestly thought the ad was a scam. Something seemed fishy. So I'm looking at the photos and I realize that on the back, someone added an extra S. So obviously this gentleman, by looking at it, thought it was a Miura SS, which somebody probably did in the late 60s or early 70s to be cool or something along those lines. And I realized that the car was legitimately sitting in a barn. You had tools and there was like beach chairs leaning up against it, and it was literally in the middle of someone's junk pile. So I immediately called the guy back. I said, listen, I'm very interested. What are you guys asking? And at the time he said like some crazy numbers, like 1.4 million. Okay, maybe the best Miura S example at the time would sell for that. And I said, well, I'm interested, but I need to inspect the car and I really need to do some research because you haven't given me great information. And he said, well, I need to close in like 48 hours. I was like, 48 hours? I mean, nobody in the world closes on $1 million car, vintage car, in 48 hours. I mean, there's so much due diligence. You need to inspect body stamps. You need to inspect the engine number. And really then, with Lamborghinis, and especially Miuras, there's no data available. So you're contacting Italy, you're contacting other historians. Personally, I'm going to go through some notes and I'll consult with my dad. But again, nobody's closing on a car like that quick. I told him, okay, then what's the price to close immediately? And he said, well, my boss is in a bind. He's owned the car since 1971 and he needs cash immediately. I said, well, there's got to be a concession from your 1.4 to close immediately. I said, I still will need to see the car. I'll send you a deposit immediately. And we ended up coming to a number that was actually extremely fair. I called my business partner and I said, Jordy, you got to go raise the money. So within a couple days, we put a deposit. I scheduled to fly up to, it was actually in upstate New York. And I called a friend of mine. I said, hey, the time of the flight and everything, it's a little sort of too long for me to, take a taxi or anything. Do you mind if you could just send a driver and we can find the location together? I don't want to rent a car. I'm probably going to get lost. So great. So I fly up to New York. At this point, the gentleman, I think, had $50,000 deposit. We had a signed contract, but really things were rushed so quickly that, I hadn't done too much more due diligence. I had cell phone photos and I had a chassis number, but that was about it. I knew it was essentially a Miura S. I didn't know why there was an extra S. And there were some other weird features about the car. So we finally, I land in New York, I get picked up. We start driving, and at this point, we're probably an hour outside of New York, and we're in the farm field. Definitely in the countryside, you could call it, of New York. My cell phone reception just dies. I literally have one bar that's struggling. It comes on, it goes off, it comes on, it goes off. So now I'm trying to reach the gentleman that basically took my deposit, and I can't reach him. And we're lost. So I have to say, for about 10, 15 minutes, I thought I might have been taken by a terrible eBay ad with horrible photos and no description. But after about 15 minutes of freaking out, my phone rang finally. And he's like, no, you're at the wrong barn. I see your car. Come over here. So we pull up to this actually beautiful sort of country home. And there's this white barn that's probably 40 feet by 30 feet. It's not terribly large, but it's not connected to any power. You can see it's just an old barn. He has like one of the workers come and open up these two large doors. And as he's opening it up, there it is, a 1967 Lamborghini Miura S. Now, it was actually a 1968 car. I saw that the car was very original. It had mostly original paint, which I was pretty shocked about. And it had some features where you just know, like example, on a Lamborghini Miura, the clutch master and brake master, they normally have protective covers that would go by the master cylinder, and they were actually still there. People, when the cars were new, they were bleeding the brakes, they'd take that off. So it had some really, really unique originality to the car. The rubber around the windshield, it's almost impossible to paint the car or pull out the windshield without sort of damaging the rubber and having to put new style rubber in. You could tell it was the original rubber, the original chrome trim. So the car was remarkably original. I was shocked. I think I was more concerned about what was living in the car or around the car. But I was definitely, we were buying the car. It was there. It was not running, but it was one of those cars that it just had so much character. There was still a Rolling Stones cassette in the cassette player. It still had old 70s style interior. So we had to buy it. We purchased the car. We brought it back to Miami, and probably within like 30 to 60 days, sold the car fairly quickly. We sold it to a former NHL hockey player that fell in love with its originality. And what's funny is, oddly enough, maybe about a year later, he started advertising the car for these crazy sums, 2.2 million, 2.3 million, 1.9 million. And the car started popping up at auctions around the country. Now, the very funny part about the story was the auction companies and the person that was representing the car was actually telling the story that they found the car in the barn. And they were even telling a story that was embellished upon my story in saying that, oh yeah, I went to go buy a snow blower and I found this Miura. And I caught numerous people in the process of them trying to sell me the car, telling me that they found the car or someone else found the car. To the point where even some of the auction houses and different people were using my photos that I originally took when I first found the car. The reality was, I think the car could have brought more, marketed the right way at the right auction, but it floated to these, like, it wasn't at Gooding or RM Sotheby's, let's put it that way. So it floated to these random auctions that was like, that's not the market, and that's not how you present the car. You should tell its correct history and the whole story, and even use us, you know? So considering the way we found it, and the fact that it was essentially the first Miura that Curated purchased when we first opened our dealership, it's probably one of the most important stories. Sometimes life's about taking risks. It's about looking at opportunities and different things like that. And that was definitely a risk. It paid off. It gives you a warm feeling when you see something that you discovered or your product floating around, and whether it's your story or not.